testifying about the DNA testing that you conducted on a pair of DK and Wailuku.
Yes.
Recall that? Okay. Let's move on to the next item that's on the table, and I'll go ahead and put that up on the screen. It shows that you conducted tests on 2 swabs from a mace paper spray canister. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Can you describe the testing that you did on that?
So there were swabs, so I just took a cutting of a portion of each of the swabs. I took that through the DNA testing procedures. So there was no blood testing done on those. And I took it through DNA, and there was no DNA profile obtained from that sample.
Okay. Now, there were some swabs that were taken from the that's listed on the table there from marked jeans from a right leg and left leg. Can you describe what that is?
So these were swabs that were submitted for testing. I didn't recover these swab samples, so the swabs themselves were asked to be tested, so I did so.
And as far as these swabs are concerned, did you conduct the 2 blood tests that you mentioned prior on the swabs from the marked jeans, the right leg and left leg?
Yes.
And what were the results of those 2 blood tests?
So on the table it's listed here. I did blood testing on each of these swab samples recovered from the jeans. Marked right leg outside, left leg interior surface, and R leg front below knee. So the testing results were that no blood was detected on those swabs.
And like you just mentioned, you yourself didn't take the swabs from the marked jeans, is that correct?
No, I did not.
Yeah, and how, can you describe how did you receive these? Did you receive it with the other evidence from the Maui Police Department?
Yes, so it would have been received on the date indicated here, so that's July 7th, 2015. So they would have been received in packaging.
And then the 3rd swab, I'm not sure if we discussed that, was again from the marked jeans from the right leg front below the knee. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's where it's marked.
That's how it was marked.
Okay.
Yes.
And what, if anything, did you do there?
Okay, so I don't know if I mentioned. So I took the samples marked right leg outside, left leg interior surface. I took those through DNA. The first one marked right leg outside. There was no DNA, no interpretable DNA profile obtained. The other sample marked left leg interior surface. There was no DNA profile obtained. Third sample, the marked right leg, R leg front below knee. I didn't take that one through DNA.
And is there a reason why you didn't do that?
I believe it was based on the information that was on the evidence receipt.
And why would that have you decide not to go further with the DNA testing?
As I recall, there was indications about testing that was done on the evidence receipt. So I determined whether or not I would take it through DNA, partly based on the information on the receipt.
Okay. The information, when you say testing, are you referring to presumptive testing?
I believe so. So it was testing done by somebody else.
Can I object, Your Honor, to speculation also?
The objection is sustained.
With the strike.
Granted.
Your Honor, can we vote?
All right. Mr. Rivera.
Does that show to the pants? Thank you, Aaron. And then after the swabs from the marked jeans, did you conduct testing on 2 swabs from the blue jean, or I'm sorry, from the jeans waistband?
Yes.
And prior to conducting testing on the 2 swabs from the jeans waistband, did you first of all do any type of blood testing for that?
No blood testing was done on that sample.
Did you continue, or did you do a DNA testing on that?
So DNA testing was performed on that sample.
Okay, can you please tell us how you went about doing that?
So a portion of each of the 2 swabs was sampled and taken through the DNA analysis process. After the analysis was done and the profile was evaluated, it was determined that there was a partial mixture consistent with 2 or more individuals. And due to low levels of DNA, no conclusions were made regarding Carly Scott and Stephen Capobianco.
Now, in the previous testing, you reached a conclusion that Carly Scott and Stephen Capobianco could not be excluded from a certain item. In this particular testing for the 2 swabs from the jeans waistband, you concluded that no conclusions could be made. Can you explain that a little further?
That's just the result I obtained. So I didn't collect the swab samples, so I'm not sure how items were sampled, so I wouldn't be able to talk about that.
So just from the result, you can only talk about the results of your test.
Correct.
Does that conclude the testing of the items that you would have received on July 7th, 2015?
I believe so. I have to double check my report though.
Okay, if you can double check that, please.
Yes, those were all the items for July that I received on July 7, 2015.
Now, prior to coming to court today, Ms. Kashimoto, did you prepare an STR results table with respect to your conclusions with certain of the items that you conducted DNA testing on?
Yes, I did.
And just briefly, what is the STR results table?
So the STR results table is actually taken from my reports, and it's actually showing the profiles that I obtained from specific samples.
And General May approach Ms. Kashimoto's State's Exhibit 436 marked identification.
Yes.
And just for the record, counsel has had a chance to see this. Ms. Kashimoto, please take a look at State's Exhibit 436 marked for identification.
Okay.
Is that the STR results table that you, I guess, prepared prior to coming to court today?
Yes.
And does it contain the results for certain items where that you conducted DNA testing on?
Yes, it does.
And can you tell us which items were these?
So this table is going to show the DNA results that I obtained for the swabs from the nails marked distal, the blue jeans DKNY brand, the sample taken from the waistband, the blue jeans DKNY brand, one of the stains taken from that item, and then a second stain taken from the blue jeans DKNY brand It also has the DNA results for the toothbrush, which is listed as a personal effect of Carly Scott, and the DNA profile obtained from the reference buccal swabs from Stephen Capobianco.
And does using this STR result table assist you in further explaining and confirming the results you reached through your DNA testing on these particular items?
Yes, it would help me assist show the jury how I make my comparisons.
Are they accurate from the numbers and the report that you submitted as an official report in this case?
It would have been taken directly from my report.
Have they been altered or changed in any way?
I don't see any indication of alteration.
You know, at this time, the state would move into evidence case exhibit 436, marked identification.
Mr. Carney?
Can I have a brief review?
Yes.
Now, this is a grid, correct?
Excuse me?
We can call this table, you can call this table a grid, correct? Or a table? What would
We
you
usually
prefer?
refer to it as a table.
Okay. And the left side of the table going down, that has the location of the 16 genetic markers you look at?
Yes, so those are on the left column, that indicates the genetic locations that we examine.
Okay, and what are, in scientific terms, what are those referring to?
The scientific terminology is a locus or a loci, is the plural.
Okay, and on this you show all 16, was loci the plural?
Yes,
All 16 of the loci, is that correct?
yes,
And that includes for the blue jeans and the waistband, correct?
correct.
Now, when you made your determinations, though, you did not use all of those 16 loci, correct?
For
The jeans.
termination,
Well, like some of those loci, the DNA levels were too low to be considered reliable, correct?
I wouldn't say they're unreliable. So
They're-
it's the DNA profile that we obtain. We'll evaluate it and we'll determine whether or not it's at a level that we can use for comparison.
Okay, and several of the loci related to the waistband of the blue jeans, you determined that those were at levels that were not going to be used because of the low level.
Define used.
Inputted to make your statistical frequency.
Okay, so in regards to the frequency estimates. So in general, the profile that we obtained, we'll take a look at it. We'll make comparisons against the known profiles. But there are situations when we won't utilize certain genetic locations to calculate those frequency estimates.
Okay. And that is what occurred in this case, correct?
Correct. There were a few locations that were not used to calculate the frequency estimates.
Well, isn't it as true with regards to the waistband that there are as many that you did not use than that you used?
I would have to refer to my report. Okay, so the frequency estimate for the DNA profile that was obtained from the waistband of the jeans, we used 6 out of the 13 loci or genetic locations that we commonly use to calculate the frequency estimates.
And you didn't use the other ones because the level of DNA at those locations was too low, correct?
So for mixed DNA profiles, if a genetic characteristic is too low, we err on the side of caution or more conservative. So we actually just eliminate that genetic location when we determine our frequency estimates.
Right, so based on that, and that's part of the standard operating procedures, right?
Yes,
Those are set by the laboratory
yes,
to ensure reliability.
yes.
And so based on those protocols and procedures, several of the loci that are listed in this table were not used, correct?
We would utilize the genetic characteristics or to make comparisons. But when it comes down to calculating the frequency estimates, we may not use some of the locations if it's at a low level.
And that's to ensure reliability.
Not necessarily to ensure reliability, it's more erring on the side of conservatism, where we're just excluding that entire genetic location in order to calculate a frequency estimate.
Okay.
So we can still utilize the data. It's just when it comes down to calculating our frequency estimates, we're going to eliminate that.
And again, we're talking about eliminating, and the thing that you're looking at each loci are alleles. Is that the scientific term for it?
Yes.
And so when you're calculating your statistical frequency, you are eliminating certain alleles. Is that correct?
We'll eliminate the alleles that are present at a specific locus if it's at too low a level.
Right. And it's well documented that artifacts are non-DNA, will show up as alleles, but result from non-DNA material. Is that fair to say?
I wouldn't say they show up as alleles. There are artifacts that are present when we look at raw data, but as part of our training, we screen the raw data and we determine whether or not something that we're seeing can be attributed to a true allele or a genetic characteristic, or if it's an artifact.
And when you're reviewing this material, you're looking at an electropharogram, is that correct?
Yes.
And that's kind of a printout that has peaks, and you look at and the peaks represent the alleles, is that correct?
Ultimately, it's a printout, but we visualize it on a computer first.
Okay, and you're looking at peaks, and those peaks represent alleles?
Correct.
And if the peak is not high enough, sometimes you eliminate those, not because maybe they're not an allele, but because you recognize other things in the DNA process could account for that small peak. Is that fair to say?
Well, for the peaks that we're observing, and if we mark them as a low level, one of the things we want to consider is, are we seeing the profile in its entirety? So if we see something at a low level, because there's uncertainty in whether or not we're seeing the entire profile, we eliminate that locus or that genetic location when it comes down to calculating our frequency estimates.
And again, that's required.
It's part of our procedures.
And these procedures are meant to ensure credibility as the lab as a whole. Is that fair to say?
Well,
Without those procedures, would you be a validated lab?
I think the word you're looking for is accredited. So we are an accredited laboratory. We have to meet certain criteria, standards. So just briefly, we are an accredited laboratory, which means that we have to meet or exceed hundreds of national and international standards in the field of forensic DNA testing. This accreditation ensures that we have a quality control system in place, and it ensures the reliability of our results.
And that requires that DNA, once it reaches a certain low level, if it's not a sufficient amount of DNA, that location for those alleles is not calculated as part of the frequency estimate, correct?
The accreditation body does not dictate how we do our analysis. It's the person in charge of the laboratory that sets forth what the criteria are.
Okay. Then the person that's in charge of the laboratory at your workplace has put that into effect, is that fair to say? That alleles at a certain level, you need to have a sufficient amount before you're allowed to use it as part of the statistical frequency.
Correct.
And in this chart, that contains alleles that were not utilized in calculating the frequency in this case. Is that
I
correct?
object because this has been asked and answered numerous times.
I'll overrule the objection. You may answer the question.
Can you repeat it, please?
Yeah. The chart you're looking at, or the table you're looking at, contains locus and corresponding alleles, but based on the protocols of the lab you work at, you excluded in determining the frequency estimate. Is that correct?
So the table includes the profile that I obtained. Specifically, you're talking about the waistband from the DKNY brand blue jeans. So our procedures and protocols allow us to report the DNA profile and utilize that for comparisons. But when it comes down to frequency estimates, we will, if there is a low-level DNA characteristics, there are times when we'll eliminate that locus from our calculations for the frequency estimates.
And you would agree that eliminating those low levels, locuses, or loci, it's the correct scientific procedure?
Well, again, it's based on what the head of the laboratory is deciding. So our laboratory, the person in charge of our laboratory has decided that those low-level DNA characteristics will not be used for calculating frequency estimates.
And they're not just making these determinations haphazardly, correct? I mean, there's reasons why they pick the levels that they pick.
I believe there's thought and validation put into it.
Thank you. No further questions, but to the extent the levels were not relied on in calculating the frequency, I would ask that part of it be excluded.
Right, I think for the state would submit that discussion on its latest sufficient basis to have nothing excluded with respect to this table.
The one question I do have is the discussion we had earlier, does that apply here?
Yes.
Okay, so, because I was going to issue the same type of ruling, I just want to make sure, I didn't hear any discussion about that, so I thought I'd better ask. All right, well then, my ruling with respect to states for Exhibit 436, marked for identification purposes, will be the same as as I issued in relation to states 435. In other words, subject to the discussion again at the bench. All right, and you may proceed.
Thank you. At this time, permission to publish State's Exhibit 436.
Permission granted again, subject to that discussion that we had earlier today.
And may Ms. Kashimoto step down to the
Yes.
podium, exhibit.
She may.
Which is right behind you. So, Ms. Kashimoto, let's start with can you just give us an explanation of this STR results table that you have here?
Okay, so this is, in the end, this is what we're examining. So we obtain these DNA profiles, and this is what it looks like. So let me explain. So on the left side column here, this is indicating the different genetic locations we look at. So I mentioned before, we look at 15 different genetic locations, but we also look at a sex marker or a gender marker, and it's designated here as AMELO. That stands for amelogenin. And that's just a location that we look at, and we can potentially determine gender of contributors to the sample. So on the top row here are the sample names along with a unique identifier. And then below that, the column is indicating the actual DNA profile that I obtained. So really quickly, I mentioned before about the importance of inheritance from our mother and father for DNA. So if we look at a known reference sample, if we look at the one on the far right, this is a known reference sample from Stephen Capobianco, you'll see that there's either one or two genetic characteristics or numbers at each location. So again, that's in regards to DNA inheritance. We're obtaining our DNA from our parents. So if we receive the same genetic characteristic at a specific location from our parents, it'll appear as one number. If we inherit two different genetic characteristics from each of our parents. It's going to appear as two numbers. So this is the expectation for what a single source profile would look like. So either a single genetic characteristic or two genetic characteristics at each of the genetic locations. So that's each of these boxes. If you notice in our gender marker, there's an XY. XY indicates male. So it's the Y specifically that it's indicating male. If you look at this profile here, that's the personal effect, was indicated as a personal effect of Carly Scott, which is the toothbrush. You look down at the gender marker, there's an X, so that's indicating female.
Okay, so let's start off with the swabs from the nails marked distal. Can you explain the results and your conclusion for that column?
Okay, so here, this column here, this is the swabs from the nails marked distal. So this column here is the DNA profile obtained. So at this point, when I did my testing, the only reference sample I had was the toothbrush, the personal effect from Carly Scott. So I obtained this DNA profile, and what I did is I made a comparison. So I'm evaluating at every genetic location if there's any consistencies. So the first one we have marked here starting with D8, we see there's 1114. When I made the comparison, I'm looking at the reference or known sample, there's an 1114. I go down to the next one marked D21. The genetic characteristics there are 31, 31.2. Make my comparison against the reference sample, it's a 31, 31.2. So I'll do the same thing all the way down for all the 15 different genetic locations to see if there's a consistency between the known or reference sample and that question sample. So specifically in regards from this sample, you'll notice that there's some asterisks here. These asterisks are indicating that there's some DNA that's at a low level. But overall, if I look at it, I'm able to discern that it appears to be a single source profile. If we look at this one location here, starting with CSF, you'll notice there's just one genetic characteristic and there's an asterisk next to it. So that means I saw one genetic characteristic here and it was at a low level. Because of that, there's an uncertainty on whether or not there may be what we call a sister genetic characteristic. Because this single genetic characteristic is at a low level, there's a certain amount of uncertainty as whether or not there could be another genetic characteristic there that I'm just not observing. So if you notice here, the one above it, there's 8 asterisk 9. So the 8 was at a lower level, but I have that 9 there. So I'm pretty sure that this is the entire profile because I see the 2 genetic characteristics again. I expect to see 1 or 2 for a single source profile. So I should say that when I made my comparisons, let's go down to CSF. The 13 asterisk, there is a 13 in the toothbrush or the personal effect from Carly Scott. But since this is at a low level, I couldn't utilize it for my comparisons. So after evaluating the entire profile, my conclusion was that Carly Scott could not be excluded from this profile.
And is that how you testified earlier that you were able to conclude, although she could not be excluded, she did, for lack of a better term, and you can correct me, of the comparisons, 14 of the 15 were, and I don't know a better term to say they match or they resemble each other?
The terminology I would use is that there was a 14 out of 15 concordance.
Oh, concordance.
Yes, and because this one was at a low level, there is that uncertainty there, so we err on the side of caution where we don't utilize this sample, this location here.
And then with that with those numbers, with the exception of the CSF number, the other 14 numbers, you're able to input it into the frequency estimate and receive the conclusion you did?
Yes, so the 14 out of 15, so we actually only used 13 genetic locations to do our calculations. So it would have been 12 of the genetic locations that were used to calculate the frequency estimate.
Okay. And you've already testified as to what that was, correct?
Yes.
Now, going to the next column that addresses the blue jeans DKNY brand, more specifically the waistband. Can you explain that, please?
Okay, so just by looking at this profile, you can see there's a lot more numbers. So as I mentioned before, we know that we would expect to see only one or two genetic characteristics if there's a single source profile. So since we see more than that, we know there's more than one contributor. So the way we evaluate or determine how many possible contributors there are is that we actually just sort of count and figure out what the minimum number would be. So if I see 4 genetic characteristics at any given location, the assumption is that there's at least 2 people there, right? Because you can't have more than 2 genetic characteristics for one individual. So after evaluating this entire profile, my conclusion was that the profile was a mixture consistent with 2 or more individuals. That's because there's some uncertainty with mixtures. So the or more is added there because there is some uncertainty. So after I evaluated this profile and determined what my conclusion would be for that sample, the next step is that I make a comparison against the reference samples that I have. So again, it would be the toothbrush that was described as the personal effect of Carly Scott and the reference buccal swabs from Stephen Capobianco. So I would take one by one, I would look at the question sample. So if you look at D8, the marker starting D8, you see that there's 3 genetic characteristics here. An 11, 14, and then there's a 15 with an asterisk, and it's also in parentheses. So what this means is that this 15 is at a low level, and it's at a level that we want to mark to indicate that it's what we call a minor profile. So it's seen at a lower level. So these markers are just indicating that to us. So what I do next is then I would look at one reference sample and make a comparison. So I see 11, 14, and a 15. If I look at this sample here, I see there's an 11, 14 in the no profile from Carly Scott. So then I'm going to compare. Do I see an 11, 14? Yes, I do. Go to the next one. I see 4 genetic characteristics. There's a 29, a 30, a 31, and a 31.2. I look at the reference sample again. There's a 31, 31.2. And yes, I do see it in this question sample. And then I would continue all the way through and determine the concordance. So when I evaluated the entirety of the question sample from the blue jeans, the waistband, and compared it to the toothbrush, which is listed as the personal effect of Carly Scott, there was a 15 out of 15 concordance, meaning all the genetic characteristics that I observed in the known profile, I also observed in this question sample. So then I would move on to if there's additional reference samples or known samples, which there were, I would continue on and do the same thing. So starting again, 11, 14, 15, look at my known sample from the buccal swabs from Stephen Capobianco. He has a 14 here. And I do observe a 14 in the question sample. Going to the next genetic location, I see a 30, I'm evaluating whether or not this known sample could be part of this, or do I see a genetic characteristic that's similar or the same? I see a 30, 31.2, and I do observe a 30, 31.2 in this question sample. So again, I do the same thing. I would go through the entirety of the profile, making a comparison at each genetic location, and there was a 15 out of 15 concordance also with this sample, the reference sample from Stephen Capobianco.
Now, based on the fact that there were 15 out of 15 concordance with respect to the toothbrush that was a personal effect of Carly Scott, as well as the reference buccal swab sample from Stephen Capobianco, again a 15 out of 15. What numbers, if any, were you able to input to determine the frequency or the weight of that concordance?
So I mentioned that we calculate frequency estimates. So the ones that we utilized to do the frequency estimates for this sample are the ones that didn't have any indication of low-level DNA. So it would have been the location here. This is D3, there's no asterisk, right? So one marked THO1, there's no asterisk here, no low level. D13, there's no asterisk, so we utilize that. And then I should mention that we calculate, our laboratory policy is that as of now, we utilize 13 genetic locations to calculate the statistics or the frequency estimates. The ones marked D2 and D19 aren't incorporated into the frequency estimates. So the next genetic location that we would have used for the frequency estimate is this one here, marked TPOX. And then the final two, D5 and FGA. So again, there's no indication of low-level DNA, so we utilized those genetic locations to calculate the frequency estimates.
Now, moving to the next column, which is the Blue Jeans DKNY brand involving the stain. Can you go over that, please?
Okay, so again, I would do the same thing, where I examine the question sample, determine if it appears to be a single source or a mixture. So when I evaluated the stain marked Q3 from the Blue Jeans, the DKNY brand.
And I'm sorry, Ms. Kashimo, the Q3, is this the stain that you did the cutting?
Yes. So this is the cutting sample. So again, I would just evaluate, does it appear to be a single source or does it appear to be a mixture? So looking over the profile, there's only one or two genetic characteristics at each of the locations. So I was able to determine that it appeared to be a single source profile. So once that's done, I'll make a comparison against any reference samples or known samples. So again, do the same thing. I look at the first genetic location, compare it to a reference sample, and see if there's any consistencies. So I would do that for each of the reference samples that I tested. And after I did so, there was a 15 out of 15 concordance between the Q3 sample, the stain, the cutting stain from the Blue Jeans DKNY brand, and the toothbrush, which is marked as the personal effect of Carly Scott. So this was determined to be a match. So the DNA profile obtained from the site matched the toothbrush DNA profile that was the personal effect of Carly Scott. What I also do is we'll make a comparison against any other samples I have. So I would do the same thing for the reference buccal swabs from Stephen Capobianco. So I'm evaluating whether or not there's any consistency or concordance. So the first, we have 1114. There's a 14 here. Now, if we know it's a single source profile, we would expect to see that 11 also. So I would continue, though, and go through the entire thing to see if there's any consistencies or concordance. And after evaluating it, there was too many differences to make any sort of association. So Stephen Capobianco was excluded from this stain here.
Now, these were the stain on Q3 that you referred to, the samples that you took from cutting. Those are the samples that tested positive for blood as well as human origin.
So human blood, I believe the
blood.
terminology is human blood was detected.
Okay.
So yes, these two samples here would have had the blood testing.
Now, going to the last one, the jeans DKNY brand where the stain, and this would be the fourth column. And that stain is referred to as a Q5.
Okay, so again, this was a cutting from the jeans, and I would do exactly the same thing I just mentioned. And if you notice, if you just compare it to the profile next to it, you see that there's a similarity. But what we do is we actually will just compare it to any reference or known samples. So I'll do the exact same thing, one by one, the different reference samples and the different genetic locations. So the same thing, there's 1114 seen in the question sample. Do I observe an 1114 in the known sample? So again, I would go through every single genetic location and make my determination whether or not there was a concordance, or if there wasn't, whether or not there would be an exclusion. So that was done also for against the reference samples, the two reference samples that I tested. And the conclusion was that the DNA profile obtained from this Q5 stain matched the DNA profile of the toothbrush, which was the personal effect of Carly Scott.
And did you also try to do a comparison with respect to the reference buccal swab from Stephen Capobianco with respect to the stain in Q5?
Yes. So Stephen Capobianco was excluded as a source of the profile obtained from the Q5 stain on the DKNY brand blue jeans.
And with respect to the frequency estimates for the cutting stains on Q3 and Q5 from the blue jeans, the DKNY brand, okay, could you tell us which numbers did you input for that?
I'm going to refer to my report.
Okay.
So in regards to samples Q3 and Q5, the cuttings that were taken from the blue jeans, my conclusion for the frequency estimate was that using the most conservative frequency estimate, which was Caucasian, approximately 315.8 quadrillion unrelated individuals would have to be evaluated before expecting to find an individual that would have a DNA profile that would be included as a possible contributor to the DNA profile obtained from those items of evidence.
And so the frequency estimate for both Q3 and Q5 were identical?
Yes.
Before I get into the next area, if I can just have you explain or describe when you receive an item of evidence to be tested, can you describe what do you do first upon receipt of an item to be tested?
So depending on whether or not I'm going to be testing it immediately. So if I'm not going to be testing it immediately, it would be put in our evidence vault, our secured evidence vault, until which time I would take it out and do my testing. Once I begin my testing, the first part is documentation. So that includes written and photographic documentation of the evidence, which includes the packaging as well as the item of evidence itself.
And as far as the packaging goes, what do you look for in the packaging when you do documentation? What do you expect to see?
So ultimately, we want to check to make sure that any seals on an item of evidence are intact. We want to ensure that what we're receiving hasn't been tampered with or hasn't been lost. So we want to make sure that those seals are intact.
Okay. And when you're through testing that particular item, what do you do at that point?
So when the testing is done or the sampling is done, we'll repackage it and seal it up.
I'm going to show you a number of physical evidence and ask if you either recognize or can identify it. Then I'll start in order with the first items that you would have received in your report dated March 3rd, 2014. And for council benefit, this was specific specifically the state's exhibits 425, 426, 427, and 428, which are letters. You know, may I approach with those exhibits?
You may.
And there's a box of gloves in front of you.
Okay.
Now, beginning with state's exhibit 427, which was referred to as the swabs taken from the bra.
Okay.
Okay, if you could open that up, I think it's already been opened on one side of it,
Okay.
and remove the contents there.
Should I hold it up?
Yeah, you can remove it, but you don't have to open the actual or the individual envelopes. Okay, do you recognize what is contained in State's Exhibit 427?
Yes.
And what are they?
So there's 4 swabs.
And do you recognize the packaging on those swabs?
So I recognize my seal. So there's a yellow seal here that I put on, and I also sign and date it. And then I also, whenever I examine a piece of evidence, I'll put a label on it. So I have information regarding the case. We refer to our Honolulu Police Department number, as well as the unique identifier, a date that was sampled, and my initials.
When you say the date that it was sampled, is that the date of testing?
The date that testing was initiated.
Was initiated?
Yes.
Okay. And looking at that, is that accurate with respect to when you did test that?
Yes.
And what was the date of testing?
So the date I have marked is February 24th, 2014.
Now, when you received those 4 swabs, which is purported to come from the black bra, when you first received that, was it still, or was the seal still intact in each of those 4 swabs?
Yes, so it came in this envelope here, and this seal was intact.
Okay, just for the record, you're holding up a white, I guess, legal envelope that has red tape across the back, is that correct?
Yes,
And that tape was, that red tape is the seal you're referring to?
yes, this red tape is indicating, it's labeled as MPD, Evidence Lab.
Okay. And was the envelope opened or the seal broken in any way when you received it?
No, the seal was intact.
And then when you received the 4 swabs therein, what were those closed or sealed?
I believe they were tape
Or
closed,
taped?
yes. So what we're concerned about is the outermost packaging at
Okay.
least being sealed, because that will indicate that whatever's within it is intact.
And then after you conducted the testing, what did you do with it?
So after I take my sample, I would have repackaged it, so I seal it up. So I sealed these swab packages, and then I would place it back in the original outer packaging and seal that also.
And turning your attention to the next item, which is State's Exhibit 426, and that was referred to as the 10 swabs from the fingernails marked distal and 10 swabs from those marked. You know, right?
Yes.
No. Okay, so I have,
And, before we do that, let's go ahead and finish up with the chain. You testified, did you testify when you received those items? You did, right?
I believe so.
Can you tell us when you received those items? And again, we're referring to Space Exhibit 427.
Okay, so these were received February 24th, 2014.
Okay, this is when you received them, right?
Yes.
Okay, and then, is there a date when you would have finished this, taken the samples and I guess, return them or put them in evidence or storage?
As far as the chain of custody, it would indicate when I transfer the evidence. So it would be a transfer after the analysis and report are complete.
Okay, and do you have that with you? Oh, do you have that there?
It's on the chain of custody here. So it was transferred to our evidence custodian, Ivy Lee, on May 19th, 2014.
Right, so did you do the transfer to the evidence custodian?
Yes.
And you signed out for that on what date again?
So it was returned on May 19th, 2014.
So in the meantime, from February 24th, from the time you took the samples to May 19th, where would the item have been?
It would have been in our evidence vault that's within the forensic biology lab.
Okay, and is that the lab or the vault that you would have access to?
Yes.
And were you able to determine whether there was any handling of that evidence after you took the samples from that particular piece of evidence?
So all the seals were intact.
Okay. And now going to State's Exhibit 426, again, these were the swabs taken from the nails.
Okay, the swabs from the 5 nails. Let's see here. Okay.
Okay, do you recognize what's contained in State's Exhibit 426?
Sorry, it's taped closed.
Do you need a pair of scissors?
Yeah, that might be helpful. But I got it. I got this one open. Okay. Okay.
Do you recognize those?
Yes.
And what are those?
So these are swabs. According to the evidence report and some of the packaging, it's indicating where they were collected from, which would be from the nails.
Okay, now you testified earlier that you did take samples from 10 swabs from nails marked distal and 10 swabs from nails marked proximal, is that correct?
Yes. So
Is that reflected there?
yes. So within each of these packages, there's 10 packages, and within each of these packages is 2 swabs.
And when you, well, first of all, was the envelope that those swabs came in, the large envelope, was it sealed?
Yes, it was.
And when did you receive that?
So this was received on February 24th, 2014.
And after you took the samples from those swabs, what did you do with that?
So after the samples are taken from the swabs, it would have been, each package would have been sampled and then resealed.
And did you reseal that?
Yes, I did.
And how did you tell that?
It has my evidence tape with my signature and date, as well as a sticker that indicates the HPD report number, as well as the unique identifier, the date, and my initials.
And when you were done, what did you do with that?
So after the completion, the swabs would have been returned to the original outer packaging and sealed.
And did you, when you put it in the original outer packaging, did you seal it yourself?
Yes.
And how do you know that?
It has my evidence tape here, which is in yellow, as well as my signature and date.
And when was that returned to the evidence custodian?
So the evidence was returned to evidence custodian Ivy Lee, May 19th, 2014.
The same date as the previous items.
Yes.
Now, going to State's Exhibit 425, and that was referred to as a toothbrush, personal effect of Harley Scott.
Maybe we should take a recess at this point.
Sure.